I am Brian Rosenwald. I'm the director of the Red and Blue Exchange, which is part of the PIDEA program here at Penn. Before we introduce our guests, I want to thank the Gamba Family Foundation and the Stavros Niarchos Foundation, without whom we couldn't do any of this programming, as well as the Andrea Mitchell Center, which is co-sponsoring this event. We will do Q&A the last half hour, so if you have questions, there will be note cards that you can write them on, and then they'll get collected, and we'll ask those at the end. I want to introduce our two guests, and I guess I'll go start next to me. Alyssa Farah Griffin is a co-host of ABC's award-winning The View and a CNN political commentator. She has served as White House Communications Director, Assistant to the President, Press Secretary for the Department of Defense, and Press Secretary for Vice President Mike Pence. She has also served as a Senior Communications Aide on Capitol Hill and has received the Secretary of Homeland Security's Award for Distinguished Public Service. Sarah Matthews is a Senior Communications Advisor at Merrimack, Potomac, and Charles. She served as Special Assistant to the President and White House Deputy Press Secretary in the Trump administration. She resigned from the White House on January 6, 2001 after the attack on the Capitol, and she provided critical testimony during primetime hearing on the for the January 6th committee. Before her tenure in the Trump administration, she worked on the 2020 Trump campaign, and she's also worked on Capitol Hill for the House Energy and Commerce Committee, the House Homeland Security Committee, and the House Select Committee on the Climate Crisis. We are thrilled to have both of these women here at Penn, and I'm not exaggerating when I say they are two of the more courageous people in our politics today, in terms of how outspoken they've been over the last couple of years. I'm going to sort of take them chronologically through their political lives and careers, but we will spend plenty of time on 2024 before we're done. I want to start with what drew you to conservatism, to the Republican Party?
It's a great question. I'll go first since I'm older. So I grew up in a right of center household and got involved in politics in, I'd say, college Republicans when I was in college. And I think for me, it tended to be, we used to talk about the conservative movement as we kind of have the three prongs, a three-pronged stool: strong on national defense, promoting family values, and then fiscal conservatism. To me, I was always national security minded, believing in US leadership abroad. And I also believe fundamentally in a free market economy and giving the most people the most opportunity and letting the market work. Those viewpoints evolve over time. I think once you work in government, a lot of just kind of the platitudes or the hashtags of what you believe in become a lot more nuanced. But I honestly think it was just, I loved Reagan. I was a Reagan Republican, even though I was barely alive during his presidency. And I think he was kind of initially who drew me in.
Sarah?
Yeah, I similarly grew up in a very conservative household. And my parents both worked in politics, and at first I kind of rejected it. They would drag me to political fundraisers, and that was like my hell. But then it was not until I got into college and I started to think, hey, this stuff actually kind of matters, and took my own interest and joined college Republicans, started volunteering on campaigns. And and then it was from there kind of fell in love with the conservative philosophy of, as you mentioned, kind of like individual liberties, smaller government, strong national defense, things like that. I was always big on defense as well. That was something that really drew me to the Republican Party. And I remember though, like the first politician that I got really excited about was John McCain. I was in the 8th grade when he ran for president the second time. And I remember like that kind of being my first kind of political awakening. And then it wasn't really until got into college though that I actually got more involved.
Making me feel old. I was in graduate school when McCain ran the second time. Did you have experiences, especially you talk about college Republicans, both of you, did you have a lot of experiences where you were surrounded by people who disagreed with you politically? And I'm kind of curious whether you're able to kind of disagree agreeably or whether you felt like you had to muzzle your views.
So for me, my background's probably a little different because I grew up in a conservative household and I went to a conservative leaning university. So my university was not a big challenging of ideas, but frankly, right after college, I immediately went into working in politics. I was working on Capitol Hill by my early 20s. And that was just a decade ago, and it was such a different environment than it is now. And what I mean by that is you worked with Democrats on policy, on communications, you attended events together. The members I was working for, we would be just fighting the Obama administration tooth and nail, subpoenaing them on everything, challenging every policy. And at the end of the day, we could get drinks with the junior staffers who worked in the Obama White House. So there was a level of like a certain dignity and a certain respect for each other and for people being in the game and wanting to be part of the process and part of the policy making that I worry doesn't exist in the same way. I think it's really fractured over the last decade. But yes, I've certainly been in situations of working with and needing to be collaborative with people I disagree with, having my ideas challenged as well. I think in small ways throughout my career, I actually think it was much later in life, breaking with the former administration and my former party, that I've actually found a more direct challenge of my ideas with people who are members of the same party I'm part of, and now want to understand why I have critiques of the direction the party's going.
Yeah, so I had a little bit different of a school experience. I went to Kent State University in Ohio. It's a very liberal school, and I was there actually during the 2016 campaign. So my senior year of college was when Donald Trump won. And being in college at that time, I was a public relations major, and all my professors knew, though, that I wanted to use that degree with political communications. I wanted to go into politics. I had done internships in Washington, D.C., and that was kind of a known thing among that major and the professors within it. And it was something I felt awkward about because I knew, being on a much more liberal campus, I felt that, oh, maybe like my fellow students or my professors judge me because they know I'm a Republican. And being on campus when Donald Trump won the 2016 election, this is going to sound silly, but I remember I had a group project, and one of the girls that was in my class and working in my group for this group project was volunteering on the Hillary campaign. The morning after the election, we had a meeting that we had to get together for that group project, and she cried the whole time. And I've said this publicly, I did not even vote for Donald Trump in 2016. He did not win over my vote. I was not bought in, because obviously back then he was kind of selling the idea that he was running on, but he didn't have a proven record to point to. So I felt like he had not earned my vote. I didn't vote for Hillary Clinton either, but I just chose to leave that top of my ballot blank. But I remember it being this really, really contentious time, being on campus and having my viewpoints challenged, because people would ask me, well, how do you feel about, being a Republican? And I'd say, hey, I didn't even vote for the guy. But obviously, I ended up going on to work for him. And I think that during that process, I did lose a lot of friends who thought, hey, well, why are you going to work for him? You said you didn't support him initially, but over time, as I saw him governing, I got bought more into the agenda and grew more comfortable. Even if I didn't necessarily agree with the man, I agreed with the policies. And so, yeah, but it was one of those times where I feel like I've always operated under that kind of philosophy with people, that I want to be, even if we disagree, I'm going to approach you with respect. And I hope that people will similarly approach me with that same consideration. But I think now the pushback that I face, kind of as Alyssa noted, is more so people within my own party who just completely do not understand where we're coming from, especially as two people who were, spokespeople for the former president, how we could, kind of break with the MAGA and Trump and all of that. And so that's been a kind of new challenge to navigate.
So since 2004, the 18 to 29 demographic in every successive election has gone overwhelmingly Democratic. And that's pretty much at this point, like everyone under 40. The oldest, so then what's a vision of conservatism that could appeal to those people, 40 and under?
Well, it's definitely not what the Republican Party is selling right now. I mean, there's the old adage that if you're young and not liberal, you have no heart. If you're old and not conservative, you have no brain. A little reductive on both sides, but I think young people lean to be more progressive. I think that they're coming up in a new generation, so they challenge the ideas of the prior one. It makes complete intellectual sense to me why young people tend to skew more progressive earlier in life. What the Republican Party had tried to do, and what was to me the peak time that I was proud to defend, and that I was so aspirational about what it could be, which would have been kind of the John McCain era, and there was the dicey bit of Sarah Palin, to the Romney-Ryan, like my kingdom for a Romney-Ryan ticket. I did not appreciate how decent the two people were, even if you didn't agree with a thing they did now compared to what we're looking at. But it was about building, giving a message of hope and a message of hope where you as an individual could achieve so much if we just have the right conditions. I love this idea of like the individual's responsibility in the country that they're part of. And if we just try to make the conditions as well as they can on the economic front, giving the most opportunities to the most people, that you're able to get ahead, and that you don't necessarily need handouts. The most vulnerable among us absolutely need support. And I think that message was one that if we got back to a place where there was an aspirational economic message, I do think that the idea of compassionate conservatism, which feels so dated now, is a very real message that resonates. And then I think taking from some of the more libertarian side of the conservative movement, which is, if you're going to say you're the party of limited government and individual liberty, then you have to be consistent on those issues. I think that goes to LGBTQ rights. I think it goes to the discussion we're having now in our country around reproductive health. You can be, I think, being pro-life is such a core part of being a Republican, but there is a place in the middle where I think so many in the party could meet women who are firmly and foundationally pro-choice, and it could be true to the vast majority of this country's values. There's this notion that you can't give and take on some of these issues, I think is a very destructive one. And I think reducing us to sort of hashtags and not thinking through what they actually mean is a problem, because it would be a silly statement to say Donald Trump's Republican Party is one of limited government. It absolutely is not. Whether it's spending, whether it's the way he wants to use the government or use institutions to go after enemies, to go at times get involved with the private sector, that's not true. To say it's a party of individual freedom, his policies oftentimes reject that. And I do think that young people, I think the Republican Party is actually, I'm big pro-national defense, American leadership abroad. That's not where the GOP is now. I think it's moving toward isolationism. There's a dangerous isolationism, but there's actually a very smart place that I think young people who are war weary after 20 years of endless wars could be. And I actually think that's a smart place that the GOP could be, which is American leadership abroad is important, but endless entanglements are not the direction we need to go, because there's almost this weird conflict where it's sort of the Republican Party that's a little more anti-war, where it's the Democrats who are more hawkish in this moment.
Yeah, definitely over the last year or two.
Yeah.
It's kind of a change.
Yeah.
Sarah?
Well, I don't want to sound too redundant because I agree with everything that
We
you
just
said.
agree on a lot.
Yeah,
We're very
agree
good
on a
friends.
lot
We
of
work
stuff.
together.
Very like-minded. As soon as we started working in the Trump administration at the White House, we didn't know each other beforehand, just kind of knew of each other, but we like immediately bonded, even prior to speaking out to Trump. So very like-minded. But no, I think you're right now. The current Republican Party and what it looks like doesn't necessarily appeal to a lot of younger voters. The things that they're espousing, disagree with a lot of it, even myself. But then I think I see glimmers of hope in certain Republican politicians where they recognize that they need to talk about these things. And like, for example, Alyssa brought up reproductive rights. I think Nikki Haley campaigned on it in a smart way, where she was saying that we shouldn't be demonizing women who seek out abortions. She was saying that we need to be finding consensus on these things. What can we agree on? And that is such like a lost thing anymore in politics, to be able to say, okay, like, hey, I might not agree with you on everything, but what can we find that we do agree on? And can we make meaningful change on that? And so she was someone that kind of, I think gave me hope for what the future of the Republican Party could look like, but that just seems like a distant future right now, just given the strangle that Donald Trump currently has on it.
And really quickly, I do think there's a few issue-specific things that are so generation-defining that I think would be a smart place to try to reach young people. The GOP is so backward on climate change. I think that if you're if they were even, and we have a good friend who's very involved in this space, and Sarah actually was on the committee, you can find Republican pro-market solutions or ways to address and try to combat the climate crisis. And that is your take on dealing with it. And you could put that up against some progressive policies that frankly are aspirational and completely unworkable, and then have that battle of ideas. But denying the existence of climate change, you will lose an entire generation of voters who have to live with the consequences. I think that is one where we've been sorely mistaken. And again, I think of a Romney-Ryan era, they were moving toward, we've got to address the reality of this, we need to come up with free market solutions, to now where some of the, most widely recognized politicians in our party won't even address the existence. I think that is one, and I think tech, artificial intelligence, some of these issues that are going to fundamentally change my generation, your generation, there's an opportunity for leadership and to make smart policy now, but I'm not sure that we're seeing it happen.
You actually jumped my next question, which was to ask you about climate and gun violence, school shootings.
Oh, goodness.
And are there conservative solutions in that space? Because I know those are two of the biggest issues for young voters.
Yes and yes. Sarah could speak a bit more on climate, but Dan Crenshaw surprisingly been very engaged on this. Your old boss, Garrett Graves. We're looking, the climate crisis feels too hard to tackle, and I think when you try to put out a 2,000-page bill that's going to solve it, you're probably not going to solve anything, you're not going to pass it, but doing more targeted approaches. A good friend of ours has a book coming out next month, mid-April, that's, I wish I had the title, Benji Backer. He's a Republican environmental activist, and he basically lays out, I got an advanced copy, small Republican right-of-center policies, but that Democrats could also support, that and he's got a bunch of scientists that weigh in that could have a tangible impact on the climate crisis in the next decade. Gun violence, that's a huge one, so thank you for reminding me. Listen, the Tillis-Chris Murphy legislation that passed last year was the most significant gun safety policy that we've seen in over a decade. It doesn't go far enough, but I'll say this. A Fox News poll that I quote constantly to my fellow Republicans, 87% of Americans support background checks. At a minimum, the vast majority of this country does. So why does that not resonate on Washington in Capitol Hill? Because frankly, the NRA, the lobby against it is so powerful and so vocal. I have been in a congressional office on many occasions when some sort of minor Second Amendment related bill was coming to the floor, and your phones are ringing off the hook. Your boss is getting notes that they're going to lose their job, they're going to be primary, they're going to have all this money spent against them. It is the most sophisticated lobby, I think, that exists in this country, and members live in fear of it. So our Republican policymakers, not to paint with broad strokes, but most of them, they are actually legislating toward more of a, Twitter Republicans and Fox News Republicans position on gun violence, when in reality, the vast majority of the country and Republicans would support them taking more action. No other country on earth faces gun violence the way that we do here in mass shootings at the clip that we do. And again, another one that's incredibly popular is red flag laws, and just having those steps in place that if people intellectually engage on it, and if we actually had the debates, it's so hard for somebody to take the under on it. I've seen some members contort themselves and try to say that, it could be too overreaching, but as a, Fourth Amendment privacy person, overreach if it's going to save somebody's lives on this specific issue. But I do give kudos to Thom Tillis, who's been very engaged on this and I think wants to do more.
So. Yeah, and just to kind of piggyback on everything Alyssa said, I'm a supporter of the Second Amendment, but there are meaningful actions that Republicans could take and work with Democrats on to try to stop this crisis that we're facing as a country. And like you noted, no other country in the world is dealing with. Another politician who's been really outspoken on this is Will Hurd. He released an op-ed. He was a former congressman from Texas, represented the Uvalde area, which was a site of a mass shooting. And he wrote an op-ed in The Atlantic last year talking about some meaningful steps that Republicans could take on gun violence, and some of which you outlined, red flag laws, background checks, raising the age to 21 for long guns, investing in mental health, things of that nature. And there's really no excuse for Republicans to not get behind them. They're going to continue to lose younger voters if they aren't taking action on this. And even parents, I think parents are worried about their own children in schools. So they want to see politicians take action on this. And so I think that that is an area that Republicans need to get smarter on. There are some within the party that want to do this and aren't, are they're offering up solutions. And so I'm hopeful that, something will change, but it seems like everyone just kind of keeps kicking that can down the road and doesn't want to deal with it. And then I think going back to climate change as well, climate change too. It's hard for when there are some in the party who won't even acknowledge that it's an issue. But then there are some people on Capitol Hill who operate in good faith, who know that this is an issue that we need to be dealing with and want to take action on it. But sometimes I just think they're at odds with Democrats on it because, as you noted, it's Democrat goals sometimes seem a little aspirational and not realistic. And we need to be thinking through, okay, but how do we get there? Like saying that we want to transition, to all electric vehicles. What is it? Biden said by 2035 or something, it's something like that. But okay, then how are we securing all of the batteries to make those cars? What does that supply chain look like? Because most of the minerals that are required to make those batteries come from China. And Biden also opposes a lot of mineral mining happening in the US. So we need to be having those conversations then. How are we going to shore up the resources then to make that transition? It's not that maybe Republicans are necessarily opposed to it, but how do we get there and do so without becoming reliant on China? Those are things that we need to be thinking through. And a lot of Republicans, like one of my old bosses on Capitol Hill, his name's Garrett Graves from Louisiana, one of the good ones on the Hill, who's not there for performative reasons. He's there to actually find solutions. And he is someone who's been kind of sounding the alarm on this and wants to take meaningful action on climate change. And so there are some people within the party who recognize that these are issues that Republicans can no longer ignore and need to be offering up solutions rather than just batting down everything that Democrats propose.
That's a really great point.
I mentioned one thing off of that is, I think the most striking thing to me when I went to Capitol Hill, well, one of the most striking things was how much of what legislators introduce is what you would just call a messaging bill. It's something that has a lot of priorities for your party. You get to introduce it, you get to go on TV and talk about it, you get to stump on the fact that you did, but knowing that there is no chance it's ever going to be signed into law. Those lawmakers are often the names that you know the best because they're the ones in front of a camera. But the actual legislation that becomes law is always built on compromise. It's always a give and a take. And the legislators who end up doing the most work, they're oftentimes, frankly, are demonized, by the way, for moderation and for compromising. But that's where the real work gets done. And it's I think of something like the Green New Deal on the left. It fell into the trap of a great thing for liberals to go talk to progressives about, but it became just as much of a thing for Republicans to criticize on the right. And the reality is it never even had a chance of becoming law. Like, I praise the lawmaker who comes up with some moderate compromises in between across the aisle that can actually try to marginally address the problem.
Yeah, especially because there are parts of that Green New Deal that probably could have gotten bipartisan support. I know we had Senator Richard Burr here in the fall, and he said the first thing he did when he was going to propose a bill was look for a Democratic co-sponsor.
Yep.
Because you're not going to get anything done otherwise.
Especially in the Senate.
Yeah. I mean, and right now you're lucky to get anything done on Capitol Hill,
exactly.
period. Were you surprised by the rise of Donald Trump? Going back to kind of the beginning, you thought your party and your philosophy was about, strong defense, low taxes, those things. Were you surprised to see this guy come along and kind of take it over?
Yes, and again, being a few years older than Sarah, I remember the first foray into politics. When Donald Trump ran, he ran on birtherism. It became a laughingstock. He had this brief kind of flash in the pan moment, spoke at CPAC, but most Republicans roundly came around and was like, this guy's unserious. So then to see him fairly quickly come back, run, and just take out one candidate after the other, I was one of those who did not have my eye on the ball about Trump. I thought for sure Hillary Clinton would win. And by the way, a lot of Republicans thought that. I was working for Jim Jordan at the time in the House Freedom Caucus. And we had actually had a plan the next day. Jim Jordan was going to go to New York and announce on Fox News that he was going to challenge John Boehner to be speaker, because he thought in a Hillary Clinton presidency, you needed a tough fighter to be the leader. So it just shows how somebody who's as big of a Trump sycophant as Jim Jordan didn't even see the rise of him and think he was going to win. I was at the CPAC in 2016 where Donald Trump was basically banned, and it was the Ted Cruz show, and we were saying, this is real conservatives. And by the way, all the same leadership of that CPAC is now the leadership of Trumpism and what he's taken over of the conservative movement. I've never seen a force that has taken over the institution of a party so quickly with such strength and with people just bowing down one after the other. I mean, it's ingrained in my brain, the criticism so many people said in 2016 who have just completely flipped on their head, from Ted Cruz to Marco Rubio and so on. We're a little bit different in that I didn't vote for him in 2016. I had genuine concerns about him. They mostly sprung from his character. It was, you know, the Access Hollywood tape. It was making fun of a Gold Star family. I was less fearful of his policies and more, this guy just seems like a jerk, and I want somebody of high moral character. Like the people I looked up to were the John McCains and the Mitt Romneys. And it was once he was in office that there were certain things he did that you would, just to get to what kind of brought me around to him, was it felt like he kind of just knocked through things. And to someone who saw how Capitol Hill worked, saw how our politics worked, and it felt so fractured and pointless and messaging and not really getting things done, I sort of liked the idea of a disruptor in chief. I take that back now and lesson learned. We'll get to that later.
Very fair. I don't think I anticipated it either, the rise of Donald Trump. I went to CPAC in 2015, and I remember him, I think he won the straw poll there of people, attendees voting on who they wanted to see as the nominee. And I was like, there's no way. And even on election night, I remember watching the results roll in, thinking Hillary had it in the bag. But I remember also talking to my parents a little bit before that. And they live in Northeast Ohio. And the county that I grew up in went twice for Obama and then ended up going twice for Donald Trump. And they told me, they were like, there were yard signs everywhere. And so they were not as surprised when that came in because of where they were. And maybe, you know, I was in college at the time, surrounded by people who, you know, really, really strongly disliked Donald Trump. And so maybe it got ingrained in my mind, oh, there's no way he'll win. But they were like, nope, we saw that coming, because they saw the support there on the ground. And then I think it just, yeah, it surprised me then, his rise and how he was able to beat Hillary Clinton. And then, yes, how he's been able to maintain that even despite everything that's transpired. I think, you know, obviously by the time 2020 rolled around, I was all bought in, working at the White House, voted for him. I thought that there was a very real chance that he would win. I did think with the pandemic that, and his handling of it, that there was a chance he would lose to Joe Biden. But I knew it was going to be a toss-up. And so on election night, though, I knew that he had lost. When I saw the way that the results were trending, I saw that Georgia was not looking good. And I thought, there's no way he's going to be able to pull this off. And so I think, but then obviously everything that transpired after that night, going up to January 6th, and everything that's transpired since then, I think if you would have told me on January 6th that Donald Trump was still the leader of the Republican Party, I would have been shocked.
Maybe the most insightful thing he ever said was when he said, if I go out and shoot someone on Fifth Avenue, they'll still support me.
Yeah, you're not wrong.
Working that into his immunity case now.
Yeah.
Did Republicans misread what their voters wanted? Was this all about, you know, Republicans thinking voters wanted something and Donald Trump understanding they wanted something very different?
Yes and no. And as the political scientist, you could speak to this with more authority than me, but you see tide shifts in parties over time. And to understand the Donald Trump Republican Party, you have to understand that in many ways, a lot of it is the old Bill Clinton soft Democratic coalition. So this is a lot of blue collar, working class voters, not necessarily with college degrees, skews heavily white and male, who care about things like trade policy. They care about, they're probably union members, but they also don't necessarily want the big union bosses in charge of things. They didn't like NAFTA. They wanted something to replace that. They're very, very protectionist and anti-immigration. They want a secure border. They don't want things being shipped off, overseas and us, offshoring American jobs. A lot of that core constituency has slowly morphed over to the Republican Party in the Trump era. So I think there were some tide shifts that were happening. He spoke to issues that were actually just not in line with the former Republican Party. But I think that there is still a significant portion of the GOP who actually believed in what we said we believed in. And I think we're seeing this evidence on foreign policy, like with Ukraine right now. 67% of Republican voters support aid to Ukraine. Now, that's actually incredibly low if you're a Reagan, Bush Republican, but it is still the majority of Republicans in America. Where Trump goes on some of the international issues, I think is actually at a step where the party is. I think it is so in our DNA to want to be tough on China, to be tough on Russia, and to come to the aid of our allies. Whether we're thinking of the Cold War or World War II, we see America as the shining city on the hill and the ones who are going to be the first to support our allies. So I think that still exists, and I think it could be a factor in the election. Foreign policy is so rarely a major factor in election, but I think that it could be. And I think that you're gonna see a real friction around the social issues, specifically around abortion. So I'm a 34-year-old woman and I'm a self-identified moderate Republican. I was very conservative when I started my career. I'm a Nikki Haley voter on abortion. I want some access and I want some restrictions, and I think we have to compromise so that women are never in crisis situations without any access. There are some diehard Republicans who will never be anywhere near that, and to even suggest that would be a step too far. And Trump, watch this space, because Trump is trying to do this right now. He is toying with, is it 16 weeks? Is it 18 weeks? And I think this is part of what Mike Pence was speaking out against when he came out and said he's not supporting him because he's a threat to the Constitution and democracy. But he also laid out some policy areas that he thought were such a stark break from the Republican Party. And I think with voters who are Republicans over 50, lifelong, have voted with the party, a real compromise on that space could be a real challenge for voters.
I think kind of going back, we were talking about what some politicians maybe missed about Donald Trump. I think something else that kind of stuck out to me about the rise of Donald Trump was just the way he speaks. And he's so unfiltered. And that was a breath of fresh air to a lot of those voters that Alyssa was talking about, that he was able to kind of bring into the fold. And they were tired of politicians who speak in platitudes. And he was going up against the quintessential politician, Hillary Clinton. Mm-hmm. So I think it was this kind of perfect storm then for him to win, looking back on it now. And so I think that was also how he was able to appeal to voters, and maybe your everyday other Republican politicians couldn't quite understand that, because the way that they saw him speak, they were outraged by it. As Alyssa noted, a lot of the Republicans who now support him back in 2016 were condemning him and calling out his rhetoric and things like that. And they couldn't understand then how that he had this support. And I think it was because it was just something completely different. People were just tired of, politicians speaking in platitudes, saying the same things, but not actually following through. And they felt like they had been left behind, and Donald Trump made them feel seen.
And a lot of times not even saying anything, it's how can I get out there and give a speech and not say anything?
Yes.
Did you have any misgivings, either of you, before you went to work for him?
Yeah. So quickly, because it's a long saga, but so I declined a job, an opportunity to work on his campaign in 2016. Jason Miller, senior advisor to him, tried to hire me off of Capitol Hill, and to me it was like the largest sum of money someone had ever offered me, because the Capitol Hill job is not a lot. But I just wasn't comfortable with who he was yet. I wasn't leaning towards supporting him. It was still a primary, and I declined it. And then planned to stay working in the House once he was elected. Was offered a job in his West Wing on his communications team and declined that. But within a couple weeks of that, Mike Pence's office reached out to me. And that was the perfect in for me because Pence was somebody I had respected my whole career. I'd gone to see him speak at, CPAC, at different conservative conferences. He was actually somebody at one point was like my choice for a future presidential candidate. And I got to know his team through working with them on Capitol Hill and knew that they were professionals. They had core ideological beliefs, and they saw themselves as kind of a bubble a little bit removed from the chaos I was reading about in the West Wing. So I went in via Mike Pence. I also just candidly, and we're streaming, I never would have gotten cleared into the Trump White House directly. PPO would have flagged me so hard because I had criticized him left and right on social media, but I snuck in through Pence world. And that was, I will never regret that decision. I will always be proud to have worked for Mike Pence. I traveled to more than 24 countries with him. I met with more heads of state with him than I can name. President Moon of South Korea, Vladimir Putin, former President of Ukraine, Poroshenko. We went to NATO meetings. He's somebody who represented America with dignity on the world stage at a time when I think people were very concerned, a lot of leaders were, about Trump. And I always knew him. I hope someday he's more open with the role that he played in that administration, because I think if every single one of the most dangerous policies that Trump tried to put forward, and usually the single man stopping him was Mike Pence, whether it was the Muslim ban, whether it was family separation of migrants at the border, and also his biggest policy achievements, Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. It nearly went down at 11 p.m. on the Senate floor, and it was Mike Pence convincing Jeff Flake to vote for it. He's a man of character who I believed in, and that was what brought me into that world.
Yeah, as I noted, didn't vote for him in 2016, had extreme reservations about him and his character. That was mainly why. And then when I graduated college in 2017, went and worked on Capitol Hill for a couple of years. And then it was not until 2019, I was approached about an opportunity to join the 2020 re-election campaign for Donald Trump as a deputy press secretary. And it weighed on me. I really thought about not taking it, but I kind of thought to myself, well, okay, even if I'm not necessarily comfortable with the man, I look at things like the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, or the economy, or the people he has surrounded himself with in his administration. I felt like he had people of that were of good character surrounding him, such as Mike Pence, or different officials in the administration, you name it. And I feel like that allowed me to feel more comfortable with my decision. Looking back on it, do I regret it? No, I don't, because ultimately it was a career opportunity, and I learned a lot from it and grew a lot as a person. And so, of course, maybe I should have listened to, my gut and my reservations about him and all of that. But I think ultimately it was the right decision for me at the time. And then I worked on the campaign trail for a year. So it was like June 2019 to June 2020. And then they were shaking up the White House communications team and asked if I wanted to come over and join as a deputy press secretary over at the White House for the last 7 or so months of the administration. And so by that time, any of the kind of, I feel like, reservations that I had faded away a little bit. And also it was an opportunity to go serve my country and serve the American people. And so I think in any administration that is, if there was an opportunity to serve in any administration, I feel like you would jump at it, just because of what an honor it is to get to serve your country. And so that's the way I look at it, is that I took that opportunity because I wanted to do right by the country. And ultimately, did I necessarily always agree with the man and everything he said or did? No, but that wasn't what necessarily led me to take those positions.
Okay, say one more thing, sorry. And I've debated this a lot with some of my progressive friends in media, and I stand by this take, so do with it what you will. Once somebody is the president of the United States, they're the leader of the free world, they're the commander-in-chief of the US military, and their decisions will have an impact on the lives of all Americans. I would always encourage people of good faith who want to go in and think they could marginally help to go into public service, even if it's somebody who may be of bad moral character, or there may be policies that you disagree with, because it gives you a chance to be in those rooms and to vocalize those things. will never work in a Trump administration again, but I hope to God if that man wins, that if some decent people do go in, because you would be surprised how much just behind the scenes influence you can have in small ways that has a huge impact.
That actually builds perfectly for my next question, which is what was it like working for Trump?
He's a character. So I admit wholeheartedly, I briefly drank the Kool-Aid and truly had genuine affection for Donald Trump. I fully understood his character. I'd seen it. I'd spent 2 years in the White House with Vice President Pence. I'd seen him scream at staff. I'd seen bad policy ideas that then our team had to help pull back. So I went in clear-eyed, but I went in about when Sarah did, so April of 2020, the height of the COVID pandemic. I went over from the Department of Defense and was asked to try to help with the chaos that was happening, the COVID messaging, but just in general. And he is a challenging person, but I will say this, it's not, you have to give him credit. He has a personality that draws people in. He has an aura about him that when you're around him, you want him to like you. You want him to want to hear what you have to say. He has a way when he wants to of making people feel extremely important and seen. He remembers things about people. And there was a 2-month period that I would have run through a wall for Donald Trump. I didn't think this was a good guy, but I was like, there's something about him I believe in and I want to root for. Flip that all on its head. June of 2020, the murder of George Floyd, the social justice protests of that summer, and seeing that a moment in our country that called for moral clarity and caused for somebody to de-escalate and to have just the character to do that and his unwillingness to, my brain snapped back to where I think always needed to be. He's a very interesting person. He can be very, very hands-on on certain things, and then something of tremendous consequence could not give two what's about. COVID was something he was virtually disengaged from the actual, White House coronavirus task force and the interagency efforts that we were doing on everything from supply chains to getting a vaccine to getting therapeutics. But then he cared tremendously about what he was going to say at the podium when he went out and did a press briefing on it. Oftentimes not having any of the expertise you would need to had you been in those situations.
Probably had a hit on the bleach idea.
I tried to stop the bleach comment. Okay, hand on my heart, and 3 people, including former Secretary of Homeland Security Chad Wolf, witnessed it. I tried to stop the bleach comment. So how this happened, may I digress here? So when he famously or infamously said from the podium, oh yeah, you can just inject bleach, and my dear friend Dr. Deborah Birx looked on in horror. There'd been a briefing in the coronavirus task force meeting in the Situation Room. What I'm saying here is unclassified, but basically about these preliminary tests that showed that heat and humidity could kill the virus. And Pence, who rarely has bad judgment like this, says, I think you should go brief this to the president and we should give it to the American public. And alarm bells are going off in my head. I literally chased the briefers out and I said, guys, what are we doing here? I bring in the White House chief of staff and the vice president's chief, and I said, what is our action item to the American public? Are we trying to create a run on humidifiers? Are we saying turn your heat up to 95 degrees? What are we doing? Kellyanne Conway comes out and says, they're briefing the president now, and within 2 minutes, that happens. So I tried my best. But anyway, I digress. I just wanted to give that one bit of credit to Trump. It's not credit, but it's to help people understand. If you meet him one-on-one, he's not a monster. He actually can really draw you in, and it speaks to how he can pack these stadiums and he can make people want to come out and see him. But the veil falls and you see the real man eventually.
Just to kind of piggyback off of something that you said, about the information that we would give Trump, that was something that we were very careful about what he would see and what would be presented to him, because sometimes he would get fixated on something. And so if we didn't want him to focus on that or go off of something, we would say, maybe don't mention that to him, or don't tell him that. And, we tried as communications professionals to do what we could to stay on message and things like that. And I always say to people working in any White House, I think is crazy. And, you're constantly putting out fires, and it's, a very stressful experience. I think working in a Trump White House was just absurd. I mean, it was constant chaos. And most of it was self-inflicted. he was causing the chaos and we were just having to put out the fires. I mean, I tell people I was there for, I think, the last 7 months or so of the administration, and it was arguably the most tumultuous period of Trump's admin in his 4 years. I mean, pandemic was raging. We were having kind of the second wave happening when I joined. George Floyd protests were happening across the country.
He got COVID.
Trump got
was
COVID.
very ill.
Half the White House went down with COVID. We never did.
Yeah.
Yeah, but, and so that was crazy. We had Ruth Bader Ginsburg pass away, and then we had to, come up with a new Supreme Court justice. The election and all the fallout from it, January 6th, and that was my last day there. So, but that was top line,
Crazy.
some of the craziness that I was able to witness during that period of time. And so, I think getting to work for any White House is kind of, you feel like you're constantly dealing with something, and it's a stressful environment. But a Trump White House was a whole different beast.
It's like a couple of we didn't start the fire versus.
Right.
Yeah.
Both of you, as well as Mike Pence, and I think countless others from the White House staff and cabinet secretaries, have been absolutely outspoken about Donald Trump being manifestly unfit to be president. And yet, if you look at the polling, his support's about where it was in 2020. It's about where it was in 2016, maybe even a little bit higher. Why aren't voters listening to the people who worked with him, who know him best?
It's a great question. I think that we need to speak forcefully and in unison, and I do hope that, especially with Pence coming out and saying he would not support him, something that's historic. This hasn't happened certainly in our lifetimes, a vice president who had served with the president saying they are unfit to serve again. That it's not enough to say it once and hope that people heard it and that resonates. I know Mike Pence knows how dangerous Donald Trump is. Like, I've referenced many times tonight his lack of character. It's far worse than that, because when a person has low character, it's having the bad character and also being somebody who's basically actively avoiding prison right now and is running for president largely to avoid going to jail. That's a very dangerous set of circumstances. And I do often compare him in my mind to someone like a Viktor Orban of Hungary, who in his first term was democratically elected, was a nationalist leaning figure, but was not necessarily what you call a dangerous force. When he got back into power, it was fundamentally different. Because something I hear from voters who tell me I'm being alarmist, he didn't destroy democracy the first time, they ultimately certified the election results. This will be a very different Trump. If you thought Trump 1 was scary, it will be about getting revenge on people. It will be about changing our institutions so they work the way he believes that they're supposed to. It'll be about taking out people who are disloyal to him out of every rank of government and reworking our federal government to essentially be an arm of his power. The effects on the world stage are unimaginable, and I don't like to speak in hyperbolic terms, but I don't believe it is to say it could lead to a World War III. He would not give a penny to Zelensky and to Ukraine. He has a personal dislike for him. He has since the moment he was elected. And he would love to see Ukraine fall to Russia. What we are staring down just 8 months from now could change the course of human history. And I think that why it doesn't resonate with voters yet is twofold. A lot of senior folks have said that. It's really like us, Cassidy Hutchinson and Liz Cheney, who are saying it daily. If you think about it, John Kelly is not out there with due respect to these people. They're not every day reminding voters and out talking to people and meeting with people. That needs to happen. It needs to ramp up. The Biden campaign also has a duty here. They need to make sure that in every suburban market in the key battleground states that they're airing him saying things like immigrants poison the blood of America, or I'll only be a dictator on day one, or playing an alternative national anthem that's, a tribute to the January 6th hostages, as he calls them. There is some of this that's on the Democrats, and I think they're waking up, but this is not a campaign that's going to be won on like the platitudes of vote for democracy. You have to scare voters into caring and remind them of what they saw with their own eyes. And finally, voters, it's a privilege to be a one-issue voter, to be like, I'm a democracy voter. Voters are struggling. Americans are struggling. People are working multiple jobs. They're not tuning into the news. They're not following every headline. They couldn't necessarily tell you the difference between the different cases against Donald Trump. And we need to realize and meet voters where they are in just crystallizing the most dangerous and the most important things they need to know about him. I never fault the voter. I really don't. I think of people in my life who I love, who are intelligent, who are sophisticated, but they don't have the privilege of being able to sit around and examine politics and pay attention to everything that's being said around them. So it's a duty of people like us to go out and to try to engage them and talk to them.
I think similarly to what Alyssa said, oftentimes I think that voters might not necessarily feel the urgency of the threat because there's only a handful of Republicans who have been outspoken against Donald Trump. And so if I'm one of those voters, I'm thinking to myself, okay, well, maybe they're just some disgruntled former employees or something, or, oh, whatever. And I'm not fully understanding what they're saying because there aren't more Republican officials out there saying these things. And so that is really frustrating for, I think, people like us, because we know that the things that we're willing to say publicly are things that these Republican officials think privately. I've heard some of these Republican officials talk about Trump and say he's a disaster and that he's unfit and all. They know that the 2020 election wasn't stolen, but they would never say these things publicly because they're are interested in protecting their positions of power. And so it's really disheartening, but I think that's why voters don't take it as seriously. And I also think another kind of part to this is that obviously Donald Trump says so much crazy stuff that I think the American people have just become desensitized to it, and they're just used to it. So he's, the other weekend said that it would be a bloodbath if for the country if he wasn't reelected. Okay, that just sounds like, I feel like people are just used to that kind of rhetoric from him, unfortunately, which is sad that this is where we're at. But then also, I do think that they're historically, looking back, I look back on someone like the way Mitt Romney was treated by the left in the media, someone who now today, I think a lot of people, even if you disagree with him politically, you can look at that person and be like, that is a good man, a person of good character. When he ran for president, Joe Biden said that Mitt Romney was going to lock Black Americans up in chains. That's the kind of way that they talked about him. So yeah, maybe Republicans then don't take the threat of Donald Trump as seriously because for a long time, the left and the media villainized people like Mitt Romney who maybe didn't deserve it. So then it feels like the boy who cried wolf. Now you have Donald Trump, an actual threat to democracy, who would actually be harmful for minorities, things like that. And voters maybe just aren't willing to take it as seriously. And it's unfortunate.
Yeah.
And I think it's a great case against the harsh political rhetoric on both sides.
For
It's like
sure.
if you deem
It goes both ways.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's not unique to the left or anything. It happens on both
It's
sides.
just sort of seeing it as a zero-sum game. You do what you have to do to win. I have follow-up questions to something both of you said. Start with what Alyssa said. A lot of what you hear is, well, democracy is not a winning issue. If Democrats are going to talk about democracy this whole campaign, they're going to lose because people are worried about their wallets and they're worried about that kind of thing. How do you elevate the importance of that? You were talking about sort of scaring people, but how do you do that? Get them to focus on the risk here?
Yeah, you have to do both because you have to speak to, and I actually think Biden has, since the State of the Union, done tremendously better on speaking to the needs of Americans, on the economy, on border security, on things that voters have been screaming this matters to me, high grocery prices. He needs to be able to do that, but to walk and chew gum, and also what activates voters is you need to have an anger or you need to have a fear or both. And I think that spelling out in clear ways, and this is where the Trump campaign, I would argue, is far more sophisticated, is as soon as something is said that any person in your life would react to viscerally by Donald Trump, that needs to be a digital ad. It needs to be in a market where people are going to see it. It needs to get out there because voters will miss it. I think that the democracy argument, and I've debated this with a lot of my friends who are former Biden aides, it's abstract. It's not something we've not experienced a taking away of democracy in our lifetime. It feels like almost something professorial that you would talk about in a classroom, but it's not a real tangible thing. I think as clear as day, and Joe Biden can be effective at this when he gets into the mode, is these people tried to throw out 80 million votes. they tried to do X, Y, Z, and just breaking down what Trump did and what he's talking about doing it next. It goes back to a great point Sarah made. Don't speak in the political platitudes and the purely aspirational tones. You need to just concrete to voters, I think, what the threat is. And I actually asked Vice President Harris this when she came on The View, which was basically, are you guys running scared enough? And I commend her that she acknowledged, I am scared of a second Trump term. I think it is okay. This is usually political malpractice in a normal political environment to say you're scared of your opponent. For them to say they are afraid of what he will do to the country, I think that resonates.
And kind of dovetailing with that, Sarah, you were talking about the bloodbath comment and things like that. One thing that always strikes me about Donald Trump is, I think the recipe that we thought we knew before Trump was that hope sells, whether it's Barack Obama or Ronald Reagan in Morning in America, that hope sells. When I listen to him, I hear a kind of dystopian, everything's terrible, except maybe Trump products. But why has that resonated so much and continued to resonate with his voting base? This kind of fear-based thing of everything is bad.
I think that Donald Trump has a tendency to prey on people's worst instincts. And I think that even, looking at the bloodbath comment, the full context of it was that he was talking about the auto industry, but then he says, it's going to be a bloodbath, and that's going to be the least of it. It's going to be a bloodbath for the whole country, talking about importing cars from China and things like that. But he works in this kind of dangerous, almost like apocalyptic like rhetoric, and Hitler-esque rhetoric too. You're talking about like poisoning of the blood of the country, because he's preying on people's worst instincts, and it resonates with his base of voters. And unfortunately, I think we have, as a country, become desensitized to it. But it does seem to be effective in working. And then also too, I think something else that we've seen a lot from him in the 2024 campaign, but also just in general the last couple of years from him, is this idea where he acts like the victim. And I think his supporters buy into it because they look at it like, oh, well, look at how the media treats him. And then they look at these indictments. They maybe don't understand the nuances of each case. Unfortunately, though, the first case that came down was a case in New York from a prosecutor named Alvin Bragg, and it had to deal with hush money payments to a porn star. This is something that was already kind of litigated in the public eye. Voters knew about this going into 2016, that he had this affair with Stormy Daniels. And so when that's the first court case to drop, people are like, oh, they're just going after him because he's running for president. And so then it reinforces this narrative of him being a victim, and then him wanting to talk about, revenge and retribution and all these things. And they're maybe not as turned off by it because they do see him as being unfairly wronged.
Yeah.
Can I say one thing though? I don't think that Trump has changed that an aspirational message can't win. I do think, with due respect to our current president, it's a weakness for him for a number of factors. If Barack Obama was running against Donald Trump right now for his first term, I think that he would be wiping the floor with him. I actually do think that an aspirational, hopeful, forward-looking vision, not playing to nativist and hate-filled rhetoric, would absolutely win out. Biden's got some unique challenges that I think he's going to have to work through. I think he's very much capable of it. I think there's policies he can run on, and he can try to appeal to better angels. But I'm not convinced that the playbook has been rewritten, that a once-in-a-generation aspirational candidate can't win going forward.
We're going to start collecting questions if you have them, and then we'll get into those momentarily. One thing that stuck with me, we had Senator Burr here in the fall. One of the audience questions was essentially, what do you do if you agree with a lot of Republican positions, especially on the economy, but you find support for Trump disqualifying? What do you do? And I'm curious as to what both of you think about that.
Great question. Always vote down ballot. Your local races matter as much as your national races do. So vote locally, vote for your House member. If it's a senator who you think is credible on policy positions you care about, still vote Republican, but don't vote for Donald Trump. If you are feeling that conflict, you absolutely should not support him. I'm stealing a line that Sarah uses that I think is so spot on. For Republicans like us who don't agree with a lot of Joe Biden's policies, the country can and has survived bad policies. It cannot survive 4 years of Donald Trump. upending our institutions, using the federal government to be weaponized against who he perceives us as enemies, and just the division that he will sow, and then the danger that he'll carry out on the world stage. I think that you need to make that peace. And if you're someone, who can't bring yourself to vote for a Democrat because there's certain policy issues that are just too fundamental, I reject that it's throwing out a vote to write in. When there is no caveat that says your right to vote has to fit into one of two major political parties, especially at a time when most voters said they didn't want this rematch. But down ballot vote for people that you believe in, and don't check the box for him.
I will say, kind of going off of that, I agree with everything Alyssa said too. And obviously for me, like supporting Donald Trump, I will never do that. Again, will never vote for him. I've said publicly that I would vote for Joe Biden in the next election if those are my two options. I can put policy aside, but I cannot vote for someone in good conscience who will not uphold the Constitution, and Donald Trump has shown us that. But I've never voted for a Democrat a day in my life. But this will be the first time. But I will say though too, I think kind of like looking at other Republicans across the board, even if I agree with some of their policies, some of them have become disqualifying to me as well because of their support of Donald Trump. Now, I think there's a difference between kind of towing the line and knowing, okay, maybe not gonna be the most vocal Trump person, but I'm not gonna, speak out against him in the way maybe a Mike Pence did, where he said he wouldn't endorse him. While cowardly, maybe they'd still consider voting for them. I look at some of these other Republicans and I'm like, there is absolutely no chance I could support you. Like if they are out there, just a couple that like come to mind, not that I'm in their districts or anything and can vote for them, but like an Elise Stefanik, someone who I once admired. She's the House Republican Conference Chair and in New York, from New York. And a young woman in politics, I really, really admired her and watched her career, and just the way she has completely debased herself because she thinks she has a chance at being Trump's vice president. I'm like, if I were in her district, I could never vote for someone like that, or I will never support someone like that. So there's different kind of, levels to it. And I'm not excusing some of these other Republicans who, while cowardly, I agree with policy-wise a lot of them, but there is different levels to the behavior of which I will not tolerate as a conservative. And I think I think there is a growing faction within the Republican Party of people who feel similarly to us.
And actually, and I think we agree on this, just quickly, Liz Cheney has come right out and said she wants Republicans to lose the House, and I'm there as well. For just the sheer incompetence of this term, the blocking, securing our own border and funding to Ukraine. But let's remember this, there's a very real scenario that Donald Trump loses and that you still have a January 6th scenario where he still incites people to go and try to challenge the results. You could see it in state capitals, you could see it in state houses. And I want to know that whoever is the speaker and has the gavel is somebody who's going to move forward and want to certify the election. Mike Johnson is not that person. Mike Johnson was one of the leaders of the, challenging the results in some of these states. So I'm at a place too where actually the balance of power also matters, and I'm okay with Democratic control of the House at this point.
I think the best way of talking about the state of the House is March 20th and the government's not funded yet. Since you were talking about it, I'll go to first audience question here. And it actually dovetails with something I was going to ask. The question asks, how has Trump redefined the GOP forever, or will it return to some form of pre-Trump GOP at some point? And that kind of fits the quote I took from Donald Trump Jr. a few weeks ago after they kind of purged the RNC staff. He said, that Republican Party, as in the old establishment, no longer exists. The moves that happened, that's the final blow. People have to understand that MAGA is the new Republican Party. That is conservatism today. So is this reversible?
I'm close to thinking you have to burn it down and build it back up. I think you could see, depending on how this election goes, the outcome being a growth and opportunity party, a traditionally conservative leaning but moderate right of center party that actually could create more of a winning coalition. MAGA is not a majority party, despite what Donald Trump and those people think. It is simply not. It's roughly about 40% of the Republican Party, but they control the institutions and all the levels of power within it. But it's this friction point of national populism versus conservatism, and the two are anathema to each other. On any major issue, they're in complete contrast. I say this all the time, I have as much in common with Bernie Sanders as I do with a populist Republican, a J.D. Vance, and some of what they're espousing. And we exist. We've been in the party longer than these people have. We're Nikki Haley voters. We're the party of before. And I think there is going to be a tide change where either we take it back over or there's such a split that it has to emerge as something different. But MAGAism is, in my opinion, it is a dying breed. I don't think it's going to go away quickly, though. I think you're going to see a lot of, the next version of it, the Vivek Ramaswamy is running for something in 5 years. But I think there's got to be this sort of separation of the two versions of republicanism.
I think going off of what you said, MAGA not being a majority party, we've already seen evidence of that. I mean, Republicans lost in 2018, they lost in 2020, they lost in 2022. And I think it will ultimately take losing in 2024 for maybe there to be some sort of political awakening of, okay, we need to turn away from this and chart a new direction for the Republican Party. But that's only if Donald Trump loses in 2024. Is that even possible for us to maybe turn away and I feel like rebuild the Republican Party, or whether it's rebuilding or going back to our roots or whatever it is. But even seeing to the kind of like protest votes that we saw yesterday happening in states across the country. I mean, in Florida, there was about, I think, 20% of voters who voted for someone other than Donald Trump in the Republican primary. Now that is a closed primary, meaning that Democrats can't cross over and vote in that primary, like we saw a lot of Democrats do in voting for Nikki Haley in other states where they are able to change their voter registration. Florida, you can't do that. And so it was a closed Republican primary. They had 20% of voters there who did not support Donald Trump weeks after other people have dropped out of the race. Right. And they voted so in protest to show that they want another option. And so that gives me hope that there's a growing faction within the party who feels similarly to us, and a little bit of hope for the future. But I don't think that will even be possible unless Donald Trump loses in 2024. And even still then, I think it will take a long time to kind of rid ourselves of MAGAism.
Well, Alyssa just mentioned January 6th and certifying the election, and you mentioned something hopeful for last night. I hate to kind of take it to the negative, but one stat that jumped out at me last night from your home state, 63% of Ohio Republican voters said President Biden didn't win in 2020. How do we combat that kind of misinformation?
I mean, it's terrifying. You have elected Republicans who know better, like Elise Stefanik and Kevin McCarthy and others, who lie about it. So the average voter thinks if their elected officials are telling them, and a number of them, not just Donald Trump, are saying that it was stolen, you have every reason to start believing that. If you have massive media platforms that get millions of views saying that, I understand why you would start to believe that. Despite the fact that every court case was knocked down, and that in fact, actually one of the studies or investigations that was done showed that they undercounted votes for Biden in a place that they said there was massive fraud for Trump. We live in an era of dangerous disinformation and misinformation. And in this moment, we also need to keep our eyes on how foreign adversaries exploit that. When you look at the social media landscape, what you're seeing on TikTok, what you're seeing on Twitter or Facebook, oftentimes it is something that was directly put there by one of America's adversaries to pit Americans against each other, to divide us, to make us distrust each other. And I think that I'm confident, I no longer get classified briefings, that there was a foreign adversary effort behind the amplification of what we call the big lie. It's hard to come back from that, because when people just stop believing reality, it's hard to communicate to them. I think the strongest way would be for Biden to win again. Harder to say that it happened twice, but
maybe win bigger.
Yeah, win bigger.
It's hard to have a question. This question is actually really interesting. Trump has referred to the press as the enemy of the people, and you have both either dealt with the press in a communications role, or you're now in the media. And what do you think the average person misunderstands about the press?
It's so interesting. He used very anti-democratic, anti-First Amendment rhetoric about the press all the time. But it was interesting because behind the scenes, he actually cared significantly about how he was covered in media. He followed certain reporters, like everything they printed. He knows the power of it in swaying opinion, but he never could wrap his head around the role that it is not their job to serve his purposes. It is to simply give facts to the American public. There's some very basic, like civic and constitutional concepts that Donald Trump has chosen to never try to understand. And the language matters because I think I literally had forgotten about this until Jake Tapper mentioned it to me. There were pipe bombs sent to journalists. There were pipe bombs sent to CNN because of rhetoric like that. Like that's a moment that we lived in our modern America. That's not normal. It's not okay. And people need to, we need to see pushback about it on the right. But what I do think the public and the media gets wrong about themselves is we can be reactive. We have certainly been sloppy at times in reporting or in covering things. And there's oftentimes, and it's why I think it's so important that newsrooms are representative and not of political viewpoints, because you need to be objective, but people from different socioeconomic backgrounds, different parts of the country. ABC makes a point to have embeds in every 50 state who are from those states so that they understand what people care about in those states and have a little bit of on the ground wisdom, because there's so many examples that Republicans will point to where the media overstated something or misstated something, and they use that and they'll hold on to it, and it end up questioning things that they see reported later. There was a big hoopla over this bloodbath comment because the context, of course, was about auto jobs from China, but he is very calculated in his rhetoric and how he speaks. He uses dog whistles, and I do think that the media could have contextualized it more, even in headlines, because it plays into a distrust that exists on the right with the media.
I will say too, just kind of going off of that, obviously the relationship between a communications professional and a reporter sometimes can be an adversarial one, but I feel like there was oftentimes a lot of mutual respect there. Even working in a Trump White House, I had really good relationships with a lot of reporters, people who I know were great at their jobs and fair in their reporting. I will say though that the Trump administration also created this brand almost of performative journalism, and it created a lot of celebrities in journalists, because I mean, how many people were really tuning in to watch White House briefings like before Donald Trump? Probably not as many as who watched during Donald Trump's 4 years in office. And these reporters knew that, and so it did kind of become this performance, and that was a little off-putting to someone like me. And I would say that the vast majority of the people that we worked with were of the utmost of professionalism, like cannot say enough good things about them and the work that they do. But that did become this weird phenomenon during the Trump years of kind of, and I think that's why then when Trump's saying like fake news media or whatever, people bought into it a little bit because they're seeing what they felt was like performative journalism on display.
And we do have a blurring of the lines in media. Like I'm an opinion talk show host, so I can speak in facts, but I'm speaking as my opinion. I think that, I mean, Fox News is the worst offender, there is no bright line really between journalism, with a few exceptions, like their Pentagon reporter, Jennifer Griffin's fabulous, and some of the folks that they have abroad. CNN, we've been guilty of this, and I think that we've course corrected in a big way, that a journalist absolutely can provide context, and they can talk up front and give their monologue on here's what happened, speak in the terms of what they do as the press, speak in the First Amendment terms. But when you have people wading into opinion and then presenting the facts, it confuses the public, and it creates a distrust. And I love the CNN brand because I think that we have really tried to play it center in recent years, realizing that the media did play a role in the rise of Trumpism. If it became it's going to make your career to everyday monologue about him rather than provide Americans the facts and let them make their opinion, I think it's important to maintain that objectivity.
That's a good point.
I just want to add really quickly, sorry. But exactly, like the media enabled this rise of Trump as well. And that's something I feel like we didn't touch on a lot. And it was because he got ratings and viewership and brought in eyeballs because of all the crazy stuff that he would say. And so they played into it a little bit. And I forget what the stat was, but like, I wish I knew it, but the amount of earned media coverage that Donald Trump got in 2016, he didn't even have to buy ads because he was just getting free ad time basically on the airwaves because they were covering every single thing that he said or did. And now we're seeing where I feel like the media is kind of reconciling with this and deciding now in 2024, how do we cover him ethically? We want to cover the things that he's saying, but do we, take every rally live like they used to in 2016? Like every single rally used to get picked up live, and they don't do that as much anymore. And I've noticed even on like CNN, if they do take some of his remarks, they'll cut away and fact check when they start to notice he starts to go off on a lie, something like the 2020 election being stolen. And so we have to find ways to combat it, but it's difficult because you want to cover him, but how do you do so?
And I think it kind of, talking about the dog whistling that you were talking about, it kind of almost goads me, like that bloodbath comment. As Sarah mentioned, he says that's going to be the least of it. So like, on the one hand, there's like one broader message, but then we've spent 3 days arguing about, well, what did he actually say? Are people being fair to him?
Totally. I mean, and I think that I'll be a dictator, but only on day one. Who says that? Like, whose mouth does that come out of? But it's a very deliberate statement that he makes. And I think the most shocking one, we didn't go to this debate. It was the first debate against Joe Biden where the Proud Boys stand back and stand by moment happened. I was scratching my head looking at my husband like, what does that mean? And I'd never been briefed. I've been briefed on other domestic terror organizations. I'd never heard of the Proud Boys. And that language, stand back and stand by, it's deliberate, it's intentional. And he did have some folks around him who would get in his ears about some of these sort of fringe, machinations that existed on social media, some of the QAnon nonsense, some of these different things that were brewing. And they would tell him to use specific veiled language and he would do it.
This is more of a broader question. Do you see a world in which politicians can more return to the center? And if so, how do we get there?
I would hope so, but we're not in that moment. I think that true leaders and institutionalists, and I would put Biden into the category of being an institutionalist, but Mitch McConnell also is, they have a duty to protect the center. And I think there's a lot of criticisms you could have of someone like a Kirsten Sinema, took a lot of corporate money, towed the line on certain things. I hear the left come after her, but having somebody who represents a red state that is very hard for a left-wing liberal to win, who wants to work across the aisle with Republicans, or someone like a Joe Manchin, hate him on coal, but he represents West Virginia. He's going to be there on coal, but appreciate that he's somebody who 9 times out of 10 is going to be with Democrats, but he's also going to look for places to work with Republicans. I think both sides are incredibly guilty of demonizing the other. And I think we also need to remember, like, we are a representative country. Even if, as a senator, you are speaking to the needs of the constituency you represent. So it is, a Joe Manchin is not going to look like a Bernie Sanders, nor is a, whatever the Republican equivalent is. It's interesting because the vast majority of this country falls closer to the center of the two parties, yet both campaign to the left and the right, and we talk about politics and pretend we exist in a universe where it's the far right and the far left, and it truly isn't.
And I think, too, as much as I would like for that to be the case, I wish that there were more people who are toward the center, willing to work together, find consensus on issues that we all care about. It's really tough for Republicans nowadays because oftentimes you'll see when they will take a vote, that goes against maybe what Trump wants. Trump will then primary or install a primary candidate of his choice in their district or in their state. And a lot of times they lose. And we've seen it play out, it's why Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger, 2 Republicans who were on the January 6th committee, didn't seek re-election. A lot of the Republicans who voted to impeach Trump after January 6th, a lot of them did not seek re-election. I think of Anthony Gonzalez in Ohio. He was my hometown congressman, and he made that difficult decision, and good man. Didn't seek re-election. Why? Because he got threatened with a primary challenge and he knew that he would lose. And so, that could be said for a number of other Republicans who have taken stances like that. And so that's why you don't see a lot of other Republicans kind of, work, I feel like, with other Democrats. I mean, even I'm thinking of like the border bill that was in the Senate. I'm blanking on his name right now.
James Lankford,
Yeah, and he worked on this bill in a bipartisan fashion to get meaningful action on the border done, something that we haven't done, haven't had significant funding for in the last like 20 years or something. And now he's being like demonized for even having the audacity to work with Democrats on this, on an issue that Republicans have been screaming about, of wanting there to be something, saying it's a crisis. So what does he do? He comes up with a bipartisan solution and then goes nowhere. I mean, it's all because Trump didn't want it to pass so he could run on the border in 2024. He wants to use it as a wedge issue. And it's just sickening, but that's exactly how, I feel like politics works. And it to some degree, it's always been a little bit like this, but just, it's gotten so bad under the Trump years of how people will not reach across the aisle and work together.
And I do think it has to be actual structural changes at this point. It's not going to be organic. I think you have to just end partisan gerrymandering. If you have people who exist in a district that's drawn in such a way that they are safe for the rest of their lives, never doing a damn thing, and they never have to meet in the middle because it is so partisan one way, like the House will not work that way. Yeah. I, as a lifelong conservative, can't believe I've come to this conclusion. I actually think bringing back a form of earmarks works. It makes members accountable to the district they serve, not to the national debate or being on Fox News or social media clout, which is frankly what Congress has become. I think in the primary system, this will never happen, but rolling regional primaries, there is no reason that a handful of the early states should speak for the vast majority of the country. I think more states should have a say in the primary process. But I have no idea who would ever spearhead any of those changes.
I think that maybe the most hopeful one or possible one is the Alaska top two or ranked choice.
Yeah, the ranked choice, I do think is
that does seem to play to people in the center and give people a chance. Someone asked about what the Republican Party can do to protect the right to IVF in the Alabama IVF rule.
So they could, the Senate could draft and pass something. There would be 65 votes to federally codify, and I forgive that it's not from a policy standpoint something I ever thought I would have to learn up on. I never thought that we'd be talking about federally protecting your right to IVF. It just shows how sort of backward on this issue we've gone. But they could codify into law. There'd be 65 votes. There are enough Republican senators who would be there. There's legislation that exists now that's basically a messaging bill, which I talked about, which is essentially saying we support a woman's right to IVF. That does nothing. It's not binding. It isn't something that could overstep some of these state decisions, but I think that's incredibly important. It is a 90% issue, if not higher. You can't say you're pro-family, you can't say you're pro-woman or pro-life and not want to give women the means to be able to plan for their family.
Yeah, and unfortunately, Speaker Mike Johnson in the House has kind of waffled on this issue a bit. He hasn't really been as strong. You've seen a lot of other Republicans who know that this is crazy. The Republicans, not from Alabama, and who have been really strong in their support for IVF, but he has not, which is very concerning. And so it's something I've been watching and keeping an eye on.
But on the flip side of that, I think it's important for voters to remember, because I think we all believe that abortion will be a very motivating issue in 2024. However, there's very little the federal government can do to restore Roe or restore abortion. And I say that because there are not 65 votes in the Senate for maybe 15 weeks. That's a stretch to say that federally you have protections up to 15 weeks. I don't even see an appetite to do that with Republicans. Joe Biden, short of, God forbid, 3 justices dying, you're not going to see the makeup of the Supreme Court fundamentally change. This is where the states matter and who you're voting for more locally does. I think it's a challenge for Biden because they're banking a lot on people turning out to restore abortion rights, and he can't do that by executive action. I think Obama probably would have and let it get challenged in the courts, though.
Unfortunately, that's part of the problem with the political system is neither side wants to say, look, we can't do this. Yeah. We don't have the power to do this. We don't have the votes. This is going to be a long-term project. Yeah. And I think that kind of builds unrealistic expectations among voters about what is achievable.
And Nikki Haley did say that, and I think it resonated with people who understand how the system works, but I don't think